let's get right into it. Number 10. Easter Island. You've probably seen pictures of those giant stone heads staring out at the ocean, but what you might not know is that those heads actually have bodies buried underground. Yeah, those aren't just heads. They're full statues, some as tall as a 4-story building. The people of Easter Island built hundreds of these things and moved them all over the island. But here's where it gets dark. To move these massive statues, they cut down trees. Lots of trees. In fact, they cut down every single tree on the island. By the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. No trees meant no boats for fishing, no wood for houses, and no way to leave. The population crashed from about 15,000 people to just a few thousand. When food got scarce, they started turning on each other. There are stories that they resorted to cannibalism. The survivors ended up living in caves, probably wondering what their ancestors were thinking when they decided building giant stone heads was more important than having trees. Number 9. The Assyrian Empire. These guys were basically the ancient world's version of a superpower. Think of them as the original military-industrial complex. They had iron weapons when everyone else was still poking each other with bronze. They built massive cities with libraries bigger than anything else in the world at the time. The Assyrians were so organized, they had a postal service when most people didn't even know how to write their own names. But they went from being the most powerful empire in the world to completely gone in just a few years. Their capital city was called Nineveh. It was like ancient New York, Paris, and Tokyo rolled into one. Then in 612 BC, it got hit so hard by their enemies that people literally forgot where it was. We're talking about a city that was lost for over 2,000 years. Archaeologists only found it again in the 1800s. The craziest part is, we found evidence that the people who destroyed Nineveh were so angry, they didn't just burn the city, they went through and systematically smashed every single statue they could find. Number 8. The Minoan Civilization. Imagine being so advanced that you have flush toilets when most of the world hasn't even figured out how to write yet. That was the Minoans. These guys built massive palaces on a tiny island in the Mediterranean that would make modern architects jealous. We're talking about buildings with multiple stories, indoor plumbing, and beautiful artwork everywhere. But around 1600 BC, something happened that changed everything. Picture this: you're a Minoan, living your best life on your paradise island, when suddenly the sky turns black. That's because a volcano on a nearby island, Thera, decided to throw the mother of all tantrums. This wasn't just any eruption. It was one of the biggest explosions in human history. The blast was so powerful it sent tsunamis taller than office buildings crashing into their island. But here's the really spooky part. Some Minoans survived this apocalypse, rebuilt their cities, and then just disappeared anyway. Number 7. The Nabataeans. These guys were basically the ancient world's master architects. They carved an entire city out of solid rock in the middle of the desert. And we're not talking about little caves. We're talking about massive buildings with columns and decorations that would make the fanciest Las Vegas hotel look cheap. Petra, their capital city, had something even more impressive. A water system so advanced we still can't figure out exactly how they did it. They could collect every single drop of rain in the desert and store it for years. But here's the weird part. These master builders, these kings of the desert trade routes, these people who could literally make water flow uphill, they just faded away. The Romans took over their kingdom in the year 106, and instead of fighting back or keeping their culture alive, the Nabataeans just sort of shrugged and disappeared into history. They went from being the Jeff Bezos of the spice trade to completely vanishing in just a few generations. Number 6. The Indus Valley Civilization. Picture this. You've got cities with better plumbing than even some modern cities, streets laid out in perfect grids, and public baths that look like a modern spa. That was the Indus Valley Civilization, 4,500 years ago. These guys were so advanced, they had standardized weights and measures when most people were still figuring out which end of a stick to use as a tool. But we can't read anything they wrote. Yeah, they left behind tons of writing, but it's like trying to read your doctor's handwriting. Impossible. We've got thousands of their texts, and our best scholars are just standing there scratching their heads. Now, about their disappearance. First, their main river might have just decided to peace out and change course. Then they got hit with a drought that makes modern California look like a water park. But the weirdest part is there's no signs of violence. Unlike most ancient civilizations that went out with a bang, these guys just faded away. It's like they all agreed to ghost humanity at the same time. They left behind cities that looked like they were built yesterday, just without any people. Number 5. The Akkadian Empire. These guys were the first empire in the world. Their founder, Sargon, was such a boss that people were still telling stories about him 2,000 years after he died. He built an empire stretching from what's now Iraq all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. Around 2200 BC, something went terribly wrong. Scientists found evidence of what they call the 4.2 kilo year event. Basically, Mother Nature decided to turn the entire region into a giant desert. Rivers dried up, crops failed, and people started getting hangry. Then, as if a massive drought wasn't bad enough, these guys called the Gutians showed up. Picture a bunch of mountain people who decided city life looked pretty good. They came down from the hills and started causing chaos. The empire was already dealing with rebellions, and this was like throwing gasoline on a fire. They left behind some pretty impressive stuff, though, like the first ever collection of laws written down, and stories about their kings that sound like ancient superhero movies. Number 4, the Khmer Empire. Imagine building the biggest religious structure in the world, ruling most of Southeast Asia, and then just vanishing. That's exactly what the Khmer Empire did. These guys built Angkor Wat, a temple so massive it makes modern skyscrapers look like Lego blocks. But here's where it gets weird. One day, this mighty empire just packed up and left. We're talking about millions of people who just walked away from their mega city. Now, you might be thinking, well, they probably got invaded, right? But that's not the whole story. Sure, they had some trouble with their neighbors, the Siamese, who weren't exactly bringing welcome baskets. But the real killer might have been something as simple as rain, or the lack of it. The Khmer Empire built this crazy advanced water system. It was like ancient plumbing on steroids. They could control entire rivers and feed millions of people. But then the weather went nuts. They got hit with mega droughts followed by monster monsoons. Imagine trying to keep your garden alive when Mother Nature can't decide between Death Valley and Waterworld. Their whole water system fell apart. Number 3, the Maya Empire. Alright, picture building some of the most advanced cities in history, figuring out astronomy better than anyone else at the time, and inventing chocolate. That was the Maya Empire. These guys could predict solar eclipses centuries in advance when most people thought the sun was just a really bright torch in the sky. But around the year 800, they just started abandoning their cities. We're talking about places that took generations to build, just left to the jungle. For years, people thought they were wiped out by some massive disaster or invasion, but it looks like the Maya Empire died a death by 1,000 cuts. First, they chopped down too many trees. Then the weather went haywire with massive droughts, and to top it off, their kings started going to war with each other, like they were filming some ancient version of Game of Thrones. The creepiest part is, when they left their cities, they killed their temples. They deliberately broke their sacred objects and scattered them around. Number 2, the Olmecs. These guys lived in 1500 BC. They're most famous for building these massive stone heads. We're talking about sculptures bigger than a car, carved from volcanic rock. The Olmecs had to move these massive rocks over 90 miles, through swamps and jungles, without wheels or metal tools. Scientists still can't figure out exactly how they did it. But the real mystery isn't how they built these heads. It's why they suddenly stopped. Around 400 BC, the Olmecs just vanished. They abandoned their cities, stopped making their art, and disappeared into history. The creepiest part is some of those giant stone heads were found deliberately buried, face down in the earth, like someone was trying to hide them. Number 1, the Anasazi. These guys were desert people. They built massive apartment complexes into cliff faces. We're talking about buildings that are still standing after 800 years. The really wild part is they did all this without metal tools, wheels, or even pack animals. Around the year 1300, they just walked away from everything, left their homes, their stuff, even their cooking pots and baskets. Before they left, they sealed up their sacred underground chambers called kivas, like they were closing a door they never planned to open again. Some of them even burned their own buildings. Now, you might be thinking, well, maybe there was a drought or something. And yeah, there was. But these people had survived droughts before. What's really spooky is the evidence we've found of violence. We're talking about entire families that didn't look like they died peacefully. Some archaeologists think the Anasazi might have turned on each other when things got really bad. Imagine being so desperate for food you'd try to hunt your own neighbors. That's all for today. I'll be making similar videos in the future. Subscribe to see them.